Here's the part that makes this even stranger. Despite how widespread this feeling is, almost no one explains it clearly. You'll hear fragments, headlines, buzzwords, but never the full picture. Not because the answer is impossible, but because it doesn't fit neatly into a headline, and it makes people uncomfortable. So instead, we get surface explanations, temporary excuses, quick fixes that don't really fix anything. And over time, that creates a gap. A gap between what people are experiencing and what they're being told. That gap is where frustration lives. Because you can feel that something fundamental changed, but every explanation you hear sounds incomplete, like someone is circling the truth without ever landing on it. And that's not an accident. Some changes are easier to manage when people feel them individually instead of understanding them collectively. So before we talk about what changed, we need to slow down and look at how this pattern actually works. Because once you see the structure behind it, the confusion starts to dissolve. Have you noticed something strange lately? Not just that prices are higher, not just that life feels more expensive. It feels heavier. You work just as hard, maybe harder than before, but somehow everything feels tighter. Rent feels aggressive. Groceries feel like a bad decision. Saving money feels pointless, and planning the future feels risky. What's unsettling is that no one warned you. There was no announcement saying, by the way, life is about to get harder. No vote, no letter, no moment where you agreed to this, and yet, here you are, feeling the pressure anyway. At first, it feels personal, like maybe you made the wrong choices, like maybe you should have tried harder, saved more, moved faster. But deep down, something doesn't add up. Because when millions of people feel the same pressure at the same time, it stops looking like coincidence. It starts feeling like something changed quietly, and no one explained it to you. And once you start noticing that shift, you can't unsee it. Let's slow this down for a moment. Because despite how overwhelming this feels, what's happening isn't complicated. It's not chaos, it's not random, and it's not millions of separate problems colliding at once. What you're feeling follows a structure, a pattern. And once you see that pattern, the pressure starts to make sense. Not in a comforting way, but in a clear one. The mistake most explanations make is jumping straight into details, data, policies, charts, but that just adds noise. What actually matters is understanding how systems behave when they're pushed in certain directions for long enough. This isn't about one bad decision. It's not about one crisis, and it's not about one generation doing things wrong. It's about incentives stacking up over time until the outcome becomes predictable. So instead of reacting to symptoms, prices, stress, instability, we need to step back and look at the structure underneath. Because once you understand that structure, the confusion you've been feeling stops being personal and starts being logical. What makes all of this even more frustrating is how hard it is to explain. You try to talk about it with friends, and the conversations go nowhere. Some people say, it's just inflation. Others say, you just need a better job. Or, that's life now. Get used to it. And after a while, you stop bringing it up, because it starts to feel like you're complaining about something vague, something you can't quite prove. You're not broke, you're not unemployed, you're not failing in any obvious way, and yet you feel behind, like the rules shifted while you weren't looking. What's worse is the quiet guilt that creeps in. Maybe you should have invested earlier. Maybe you chose the wrong career. Maybe everyone else figured something out that you missed. But here's the strange part. People of completely different ages, backgrounds, and incomes are describing the same pressure using the same words in completely different places. That doesn't happen by accident. When confusion is this widespread, when the feeling is this shared, it usually means the problem isn't personal. It means something larger changed, and most people are just feeling it without having the words for it yet. This is usually the point where people get the story wrong, because the most common explanation sounds like this. People don't work as hard anymore. Everyone just wants shortcuts. This generation made bad choices. It's comforting to believe that. If the problem is personal effort, then the solution is simple. Work harder, hustle more, sacrifice longer. But that story doesn't survive contact with reality. People are working more hours than before. They're more educated than previous generations. They're more productive, more connected, more efficient. And yet, stability is slipping. That's the clue most explanations ignore. When effort increases but outcomes get worse, the problem usually isn't motivation. It's incentives. The system stopped rewarding the same behaviors it used to. Things that once led to stability, saving, planning, playing it safe, don't work the same way anymore. Not because people changed, but because the environment did. And when the environment shifts quietly, people keep playing by old rules without realizing the game has changed. That's why so many feel stuck despite doing everything right. They didn't fail. They followed a script that no longer leads where it used to. Here's where things get uncomfortable. Because once you step back far enough, this moment stops feeling unique. It starts to feel familiar. Not in the details, but in the shape. Periods where life feels stable, predictable, manageable, are usually followed by periods where that stability quietly erodes. Not because people suddenly became incompetent, not because society forgot how to function, but because systems tend to drift. They accumulate small decisions, short-term fixes, temporary solutions that stack on top of each other. And for a while, everything still works. Until one day, people start saying the same things again. Why does everything feel harder? Why does effort stop paying off? Why does the future feel narrower than it used to? Those questions have been asked before, in different countries, in different centuries, under different political systems. The tools were different, the language was different, but the feeling was the same. And that's when you realize something important. What you're experiencing isn't random. It's a phase that shows up whenever systems are pushed too far in one direction for too long. If you rewind the clock, you start seeing the same story replayed again and again. In late Roman times, ordinary work stopped leading to stability. Wages couldn't keep up, taxes rose quietly, wealth concentrated, and everyday life became harder even though the empire looked powerful from the outside. Centuries later, in pre-revolutionary France, the middle of society carried the pressure. Food prices climbed, debt ballooned. The state survived, but ordinary people felt squeezed from every direction. Fast forward to industrial empires. The pattern didn't disappear, it just changed costumes. Factories replaced farms, banks replaced landowners, paper replaced metal. But the experience stayed familiar. People worked more, saved less, and felt like the future was shrinking instead of expanding. Even in the 20th century, during moments that looked like progress on paper, entire generations felt stuck. Not lazy, not unskilled, just trapped inside systems that rewarded proximity to power more than effort. Different countries, different technologies, different political slogans, same pressure, same anxiety, same question whispered at kitchen tables. Why does doing everything right feel like it's no longer enough? What changes over time isn't the outcome, it's the tools. Rome didn't have central banks. France didn't have global markets. Early industrial empires didn't have algorithms or digital money. But they all used whatever tools they had to solve the same problem. Keep the system running without upsetting the people at the top. Sometimes it was coin debasement. Sometimes it was paper money. Sometimes it was debt expansion. Sometimes it was financialization. Today, it's different words for the same mechanism: stimulus, liquidity, quantitative easing, bailouts. The tools look modern, the language sounds technical, the dashboards glow, but the pressure ends up in the same place: on people who trade time for money, on people who save instead of speculate, on people who expect stability as a reward for effort. The system doesn't collapse loudly, it stretches, and that stretch doesn't break everyone equally. It tightens around the same group every time. The tools evolve, the messaging improves, the promises sound smarter, but the lived experience feels strangely familiar. More effort, less margin, less security, more anxiety, and the uncomfortable realization starts to form. Maybe the problem isn't this version of the system. Maybe it's what the system is designed to protect. When stability disappears, not everyone loses. Some people actually do very well. They're not necessarily smarter. They're not necessarily working harder. They're just positioned differently. The biggest winners are the ones closest to the system itself. Asset owners benefit when money loses value. If you own stocks, real estate, businesses, or hard assets, instability can be profitable. Prices rise faster than wages. Debt becomes easier to manage. Leverage turns into an advantage. Then there are financial intermediaries: banks, funds, institutions, and anyone who earns fees from movement, volatility, and complexity. When things get unstable, transactions increase. So do spreads, so do margins. Governments also benefit in ways people rarely talk about. Inflation reduces the real value of debt. Nominal tax revenues rise automatically. Spending feels less painful when the money itself is worth less. And finally, there's a smaller group that thrives on uncertainty itself. People who can move capital instantly. People who can shift risk onto others. People who don't depend on a paycheck to survive. None of this requires bad intentions. It doesn't need secret meetings or conspiracies. It's simply how incentives line up. When the system stretches, those with flexibility gain room to move. And the more unstable things become, the more valuable flexibility becomes. And then there's everyone else. The people who did what they were told. They studied, they worked, they saved, they avoided unnecessary risk. They played by the rules because they believed stability was the reward. This is where the system quietly turns against them. If you live off a salary, instability feels suffocating. Wages lag behind prices. Raises never catch up. Every month feels tighter, even when nothing bad happened. If you saved money instead of speculating, inflation punishes you for patience. Your discipline doesn't protect you, it erodes. If you depend on predictable costs like rent, energy, food, or childcare, volatility isn't opportunity. It's stress. It's planning becoming impossible. This is why the middle feels squeezed from all sides. Not poor enough to qualify for protection, not rich enough to hedge against chaos, just exposed. And the most damaging part isn't financial, it's psychological. Because when effort stops translating into security, people don't just lose money, they lose trust. Trust in work, trust in institutions, trust in the future. And once that breaks, it's very hard to repair. So here's the uncomfortable part. At this point, it's not just about bad decisions, it's about momentum. Once a system is built on debt, leverage, and constant growth, reversing it isn't a switch you can flip. If governments try to fix inflation by raising rates, something breaks. Debt becomes unpayable, housing freezes, businesses fail, unemployment rises. If they lower rates to relieve pressure, inflation accelerates again. Savings lose value, asset bubbles return, the same problems grow even bigger. If they cut spending, social pressure explodes. If they raise taxes, political support collapses. If they do nothing, instability keeps spreading. every option has a cost, and every cost hits real people. This is why systems like this don't end because someone chooses to end them. They end because the trade-offs become impossible to ignore. Not overnight, not dramatically, but gradually, as each temporary fix creates a new problem somewhere else. At this stage, even good intentions aren't enough. The system isn't broken in one place, it's stretched everywhere. This is where it stops feeling like a mistake and starts feeling like a trap. Because when a system reaches this point, every path forward pushes pain somewhere, and it almost never lands on the people at the top. If inflation stays high, wages fall behind and savings get erased. If interest rates stay high, debt explodes and jobs disappear. If governments step in, they borrow more. If they don't, markets panic. There's no option that restores the old balance. The system has already decided who absorbs the shock. Those with assets can ride volatility. Those with political influence can delay consequences. Those with flexibility can adapt. But people who live paycheck to paycheck, people who depend on stable prices, predictable costs, and steady income, they don't have buffers. They don't have leverage. They don't get to wait it out. So the pressure concentrates. Not because anyone voted for it, not because it was announced, but because the structure channels stress downward. That's what makes it a trap. The longer the system tries to preserve itself, the more it quietly squeezes the same group again and again until stability disappears completely. And by the time most people notice, the exit they thought existed never really did. So here's the question nobody likes to ask. If the system keeps squeezing the same people, if stability keeps shrinking, and if every solution just shifts pain instead of removing it, what does that say about the future we're being asked to accept? Because this isn't about bad leaders, and it's not about one crisis. It's about a structure that only works when pressure keeps moving downward. Most people aren't asking for luxury. They're asking for predictability, for a life where effort leads somewhere, where planning makes sense again. And yet, year after year, that promise feels weaker. So maybe the real question isn't when does this end? Maybe it's this: how much instability can a society absorb before people stop believing the system was built for them at all? And if that belief disappears, what replaces it?